Thank you, John, Phoebe, Anna and Jonathan for reading for us there. And I want to give us, first of all, just a context for where this story fits in the narrative of the Gospel of John. So you may not be aware, but each of the Gospels, written by a different writer, has its own kind of angle based on who the writer was. So the Gospel of Matthew, for example, was written to Jewish Christians, so you tend to find in Matthew a lot more Old Testament references showing that Jesus is the promised Messiah. You find that Mark was writing to persecuted Christians in Rome, and so his Gospel tends to have a lot more references to what it means to be a follower of Jesus, the price you pay. And Luke is famously a doctor and a historian, and so you have a lot more factual genealogy, just showing Jesus to be a real historical figure, a real man who existed in history. The Gospel of John is a little bit different because John is the only Gospel writer who literally knew Jesus personally. And the kind of angle of John is that he wants to prove that Jesus is who he says he is, that he is the Son of God. The start of John, if you look at it, it says all about things around Jesus being the light of the world, that he was there from the beginning, and that John is here to witness to this Jesus. And I want to put that into this context because I think it's so important that we understand that this isn't an isolated story, that the message that I'm bringing here isn't something that only is contained in this one narrative, but across the whole narrative of the Gospel of John. So there are two things that I want to focus on here. As I said, the big question is, who is Jesus? And there are two things in this passage I think that tell us a bit about who Jesus is and how important it is that we respond to these things. So the first is this, that Jesus is already working. You'll notice at the very start that it mentions that Jesus initiated this whole thing. He stopped in front of the man. And if we go back a chapter, you see that Jesus was actually on the run from the Pharisees. He was cast out of the temple and made to run away, and yet he still stops in front of this man. And then in verse 6, he initiates the miracle. The man doesn't come to him or ask him. Jesus is the one who initiates that miracle. And then again, towards the end in verse 35, it's Jesus who seeks out the man and speaks to him. You see, Jesus steps into this situation. That's the first thing we notice, is that Jesus steps in. What a great picture of the sovereign grace of God, that Jesus steps into the mess going on around him. And of course, the teaching before the miracle is key here. We've not even got to the miracle yet, but Jesus is already at work teaching. And he's responding to a very deep theological question his disciples have asked him. Whose fault is it that the man was born blind? But do you notice that Jesus turns the question on its head? He turns the question from causes to purposes. He turns it from a man-focused, where did this start, where did it come from, to a God-focused response. The purposes of God, where is that in this? Remember, Jesus says it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. Whose fault is it is not the right question. The real question is, where is God in this? Where is God taking this situation? You see, there's a purpose here that the disciples just cannot see. And of course, this does not just apply to this man. We see in the book of Romans, in the famous verse, Romans 8, verse 28, it says, we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. The truth is that this should be such a comfort to us, to know that Jesus is already working. He's already at work in our pain, already at work in our circumstances that look dark. The miracle's not even happened yet, and yet Jesus is saying there's already stuff going on here. You see, we have to transform our thinking from a man-centered, cause-centered, eyes down, eyes behind mindset to a God-centered, purpose-driven, eyes forward, eyes up mindset. Jesus is already at work. There's already a purpose here. However, It's easier said than done, isn't it? Certainly when I hear this and I look at my life, it doesn't just all click into place. We look at the world around us right now and we certainly find it hard to see that. Lockdown is tough. I've got to be honest, I've found lockdown really hard. And I'm in a fortunate position compared to many, but the sort of day after day, sort of stuck in your own head, you don't often have quite the time you think you have, and yet you have an abundance of time. It's a strange time, and I found it hard. I found myself feeling down, finding it difficult and being frustrated. And for many of us, there were tough times before lockdown, let alone now. You see, I think so many of us are desperate for the miracle, and in the story it's very tempting to skip to that miracle and say that's the comfort, that our God's a God of miracles, which is true. But actually we miss the fact, if we do, that Jesus says there's already purpose in this. He's already stepped into and he's working in this situation. I'm sure many of you are thinking, well, how do we get our mind there? How can we see this in our circumstances and be encouraged and comforted by it? And I think the answer is we have to value God above everything else. You see, I think if we look at verse 3 and we value our sight more than we value God, then there is no comfort in it. Because we see the blindness more than we see the purpose. It seems like madness, in fact, if you don't have the right perspective. But if we value God more than we value material comfort, our possessions, our health, our sight, our lives, then it transforms the nature of Jesus' statement. If we can transform our mind to value God above all else, then it makes that statement such a comfort. I have 2 young children right now. James, who's 2, is particularly difficult at the moment, I've got to be honest. And many days I'll look back and I'll think, could I have done things differently there? Should I really have been on my phone in the morning when this was going on? Should I really have been doing this or that? Should I really have been in the garden doing kick-ups, practicing for the next Hope Church video when I could have been spending time with my son? And you see, the only way I can overcome that kind of negative mindset, the sort of looking at the things I've done and I haven't done it quite right, is to make sure that James is valued first in my life. Within that context, James has to be above all of those other things. He has to be above those sort of small friendships I'm cultivating on WhatsApp, or above the silly videos I'm watching, or above my need to look good in a video. And the wonderful thing is that I can do that day by day. Every day is a new day for me to reflect and to reprioritize and make sure James is in the right place in my life, that he's above those things. And that's how we should be with God. We need to put God as the priority in our life, the number one, not just physically. James, I guess, is high up in the hierarchy in that way, but God is number one above all things in our life. And if we put him in that place, if we value him and daily make those decisions, those small decisions, then I think that will transform our mindset and we will see purpose in those darker times. Today is a new day. So I challenge you to do that today. It says in Psalm 63 verse 3, because your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you. We need to believe that God's love is better than life. And then we have such comfort from the fact that Jesus is already at work in our situations. Whether we feel frustrated or down, we have grief or anguish, or we feel blind, Jesus is still at work. But we need to put God in his proper place for that to really be a comfort to us. Our challenge for today, that one of the first challenges is going to be that. Let's transform our thinking about this. The second thing I think this passage tells us about Jesus and who he is that Jesus reveals blindness. Now that sounds strange, revealing blindness, but again, I'm not just looking at the miracle here, but what happens after it. You see, Jesus revealing blindness is deeper, isn't it, than the physical. if you've looked at the Gospels, you may have heard many accounts about blindness, healing of blindness, and that's because it's the most common out of all the Gospels. I think there are 5 accounts of Jesus healing people that are blind. And yet the writers in the Gospels say that there are many other accounts they could have put in here. So they've chosen these accounts specifically. I think there's a clear reason why. I think there's a clear underlying message to the healing of the blind. And I think we see that in the 2 parallel journeys, in a sense, that we have between different characters in this story. We have the journey of the Pharisees trying to figure out who Jesus is, and the journey of the man trying to figure out who Jesus is and what that reveals about them. You see, the Pharisees' response to Jesus is to feign a sort of systematic approach. They interview different people, the parents, the man, and the man again, as if they're weighing up the evidence. But we know, don't we, that they don't really care what the response is. They've already made up their mind. And did you notice that Jesus actually performed the miracle in a sort of a strange way? He mixed some mud and then put it on the man's eyes. We know that Jesus can just say the word and people are healed. But actually, when I was looking into this, it's something to do with the Sabbath and how the Pharisees had created these sort of rules around people not kneading on the Sabbath. Kneading clay on the Sabbath was forbidden. And yet Jesus is called in Matthew 12 verse 8, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus is almost kind of challenging the twisted laws of the Pharisees by doing this. Because of course it's ridiculous that the Pharisees are allowed to circumcise a man on the Sabbath, but Jesus isn't allowed to heal a man on the Sabbath. I mean, the Pharisees had seen these miracles of Jesus, and yet they still turned a blind eye. In the story of Pentecost, Peter calls out the Jewish leaders. In Acts 2:22, he says that they'd seen the mighty works and wonders and signs that God did in your midst. And yet they still could not see. They still could not truly see. And at the end of the chapter, of course, the Pharisees that are nearby ask Jesus, are they blind? And Jesus replies, if you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now you say we see, your guilt remains. You see, the Pharisees think they know what's going on. And that's what makes them blind. But that's in stark contrast to the man who was born blind. When you look at his story and his journey of faith, he goes in verse 11 from calling Jesus the man to in verse 17 he then calls Jesus the prophet, to in verse 31 he starts defending Jesus against the Pharisees and what they're saying about him, and at the end in verse 38 he meets Jesus and he worships him. The word would literally mean to bow down, to fall at his feet. He worships Jesus for who he is. When Jesus asks him, do you believe in the Son of Man? The man humbly replies, who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? This man's not pretending like he knows the answers. All he knows is that Jesus has given him sight, that he was blind and now he sees. It says it very clearly in verse 25. In response to the Pharisees, the man says, whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. And on meeting Jesus again and being told who he really is, of course the man can do nothing but bow down and worship him. And you notice this is the point in the story. Jesus then brings us a teaching moment about blindness. It's not the point where he heals the man born blind. It's this point when the man falls at his feet that Jesus says, for judgment I came into the world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. Jesus came to bring sight to a world of blind people. He came to reveal the blindness that we all have. And the beautiful truth, the challenge from this part, is that we all have that same testimony of the man. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. You see, I don't know about you, but I struggle to kind of relay my testimony because my story is very kind of classic, brought up in a Christian home. I can't really quite pinpoint the moment I sort of welcomed Jesus into my life. I was baptized at this age, but then I sort of fell away here, and it's a bit messy. You know, I think that's the story for many of us might be that. Some of us have amazing transformative stories that can sort of, you can see the evidence there. But for many of us, it's a struggle to sort of give a full testimony of what Jesus has done. And yet any of us, no matter whether our story's incredible and miraculous or is sort of a bit kind of all over the place and you're not sure about where it started, we can all say with confidence that Christ took us from a point of blindness. We can look at a point in our life that we didn't have sight, we had no purpose, to where we are now, where we can see, where we have purpose. We can all say, though I was blind, now I see. And that's the one thing the Pharisees couldn't dispute. They kept trying to find ways to show that what Jesus did was somehow wrong by the rules or wrong because it meant he was demon possessed or something like that. But they could never deny the fact that this man was born blind and now he could see. No one can deny the testimony that we give of the fact that we were this person and that we are now this person. That we were blind, but now we see. People cannot argue against that kind of testimony. They can come with all kinds of other clever arguments, but that's the one thing they can't argue against, is personal testimony. So I think we need to transform our thinking here so that we understand that we can boldly say, I was blind. Jesus revealed that I was blind, but now I see. So in conclusion, there's one other set of characters actually I want to just quickly focus on, as I think it's quite important. And that's the parents of the man born blind. When I was first preparing for this talk, I genuinely was going to kind of skip over this bit. It kind of felt a bit like a repetition. And when you're preparing a talk, trying to get it down to 20, 30 minutes max, it's hard, you need to cut things here and there. But after speaking to a few different people and praying over it and sort of working it through, I think this is actually quite an important thing for us to read. That when Jesus says he reveals blindness, the question then needs to be asked, where did the parents of this man fit in? They're a decent chunk of the story. Are they on the side of the Pharisees? Are they like the Pharisees? Well, not really, because they're not trying to actively denounce Jesus. They're not claiming that he's something he's not or trying to wiggle out of that. So are they like the son then? Well, no, because the son boldly proclaims and worships Jesus and defends him against the Pharisees, whereas these parents are fearful about acknowledging that Jesus performed this miracle. They're happy to acknowledge their son can now see, but they won't acknowledge who did it. And I think that the key word here is fear. You see, when we read this passage as believers, we hope and pray we're not like the Pharisees. But also it's hard for us to see this man and think, that's me. We don't feel as bold or as confident, as courageous as this man is, as fired up as he is. The reality is that probably many of us are closest to these parents. And that's, I think, quite a dangerous place for us to be. John 12, verse 42, so just a bit later on, says something very similar here. Many even of the authorities believed in him, Jesus, but for fear of the Pharisees they did not confess it, so that they would not be put out of the synagogue, for they love the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. Doesn't that sound eerily familiar? I think one of the great challenges of our time is that we live in a world that actively encourages us to seek the glory of man first and foremost, to value a quick retweet or a liked comment or a laugh at work more than the costly life of following Jesus. We live in fear of what people might think of us at work or social media, family or friends, if we ever profess our faith. We want to please and be accepted and be loved by people, when really we should be wanting to please and be accepted and be loved by God above all else. So my challenge to us to end this is that, this includes myself massively, is to stop sitting on the fence on this and make a choice. Say no to fear. Say no to wanting the glory of man, and instead seek the glory that comes from following God's ways. Stepping out in faith in our workplaces, in our homes, in our conversations, either face to face or online. Now, we don't know the end of the story when it comes to this man's parents. We don't know if they came to know Jesus. They came to declare that they followed and believed in him. We don't know if they stayed blind and in the dark and joined the Pharisees. We don't know where they ended up. But we do know that we have a choice in our own lives to take that step. So let's make that choice today. I'll ask the question again. Who do you think Jesus is? And again, your answer to that question, the next thing should then be, and what are you going to do about it? What's the next step here? Make a choice and then let's go for it. Who do you think Jesus is, and what are you going to do about it? Let's pray. Father, we thank you that you revealed who you are in Jesus. Help us, Lord, to step out in faith, knowing that you are already at work with us wherever we go. Lord, may we boldly declare that I was blind, but now I see, and point people to you, the one who brings sight to a blind world. And Lord, let your Spirit work in us to drive away fear by your perfect love. Help us to seek you and your glory above all other things. Amen.